Welcome to the new and improved Zoo and Goo podcast. Today's episode 1 of NBA Storytime, about the Lob City Clippers.
Oh, shizzle.
The Lob City Clippers were from 2011 to 2016. So they built their star-studded roster around the first overall pick in the 2009 draft, power forward Blake Griffin out of Oklahoma. He's homegrown talent. He got injured in his rookie season due to a broken kneecap, so he had to play the next year as his rookie season, and he actually won Rookie of the Year. So the Clippers paired Blake Griffin with former Hornets star Chris Paul in the next offseason. They sent shooting guard Eric Gordon. They sent Chris Kaman and Al-Farouq Aminu and a first-round pick. Interesting note here, the first-round pick that they sent to the Hornets ended up being Austin Rivers, who the Clippers traded for in 2015. Anyways, the Clippers got another star to put next to Blake Griffin. And if you remember, Chris Paul was almost traded to the Lakers, but that was voided by the NBA. So an interesting time in the league, time of turmoil. I know the Lakers then had to create a super team the next season. The Heat were creating their super team. The Celtics were still contenders, and the Spurs still had their dynasty. The Thunder were up and coming. So you're looking at the formation from the NBA going into teams that are built mainly off of trades to more free agency type deals. The Clippers also had a rising star, DeAndre Jordan, at the center position. They drafted him in 2008, and by the time Chris Paul was on the roster, DeAndre Jordan was ready to make an impact. People forget how good DeAndre was. He's a 3-time All-NBA and a 2-time All-Defensive. So he was a stud. The trio of Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, and DeAndre Jordan was the big three the Clips would use for the next 6 seasons. So we're about to get into the year-by-year breakdown. Do you have any thoughts so far?
I think one of the players that slept on that team was Jamal Crawford. He was a walking 6th man of the year. Every year, he was 6th man of the year. He was huge for that team. He doesn't really get as much recognition. Also, DeAndre Jordan, crazy player. Obviously, his highlights from Lob City were insane when he almost decapitated like 3 people on those dunks.
He murdered Brandon Knight.
Yeah, absolutely murdered him. And he also hit someone with the shoulder, like an elbow. I forgot who. He dunked. It was Paul Gasol, right?
Oh,
yeah.
Was that when Blake Griffin?
Yeah.
Was that the Blake Griffin game?
Yeah.
Griffin dunked on him like 2 times. It was crazy. All right, so we're gonna get into the year-by-year breakdown. It was coming off of a monster rookie season, and the Clippers' starting lineup consisted of veteran Chauncey Billups. By this time, he was pretty washed. Then they got Chris Paul, Caron Butler, another sort of washed player. You have power forward Blake Griffin and obviously DeAndre Jordan at the center. So Billups would actually rupture his Achilles midway through the season. That's why most people do not know that Billups played for the Clippers, because in the 2 seasons that he played for the Clippers, he got injured in both of them and was out for the year. So this began injury issues that we all know the Clippers would have to deal with through the next 5 seasons. So a little bit of foreshadowing there. The Clippers bench was rounded out with Mo Williams, Randy Foye, and Eric Bledsoe. A lot of people do not remember Eric Bledsoe was actually once a pretty good NBA player.
He still is. He's still solid. He's a serviceable NBA player. He's a great defender, not a great offensive player.
He's pretty garbage on the offensive end.
He's serviceable. He's better than.
He's a serviceable backup.
Yeah, he's a serviceable backup.
Midway through the season, the Clippers would trade for Wizards guard Nick Young to provide bench scoring.
Swaggy P?
A lot of people know Nick Young is kind of a meme, but he actually played pretty well, and you'll see in a second he put up some good points in a playoff game. So the Clippers went 40-26 in a lockout-shortened season. So 40 wins in a lockout-shortened season. That's pretty good.
Pretty solid.
They made the playoffs as a 5 seed. So if you think about it that year, the West was pretty stacked.
5 seed? 40
5
wins?
Seed, 40 wins.
I don't know.
The Clippers were matched up against the 4-seeded Grizzlies. If you don't remember, the Grizzlies had Marc Gasol, Zach Randolph, Mike Conley, and they won the series in 7. In Game 7, Chris Paul had 18. It was really the bench contributions that put them over the edge. They had Nick Young with 13 and Kenyon Martin with 11. The second round, however, they met the Spurs, and it was a quick sweep. And it was apparent that they needed much more scoring depth. They were just outmatched and outcoached against the 1-seeded Spurs.
That was the year the Mavs won, right?
So this
2011?
is 2011, 2012. So that would be when the Thunder.
Yeah.
So the Thunder would beat the Spurs
And then lose
in
to
the
the
conference
Heat.
finals
Yeah,
and lose
yeah.
the Heat. So now we're going into the 2012-2013 season. In order to add the bench scoring, the scoring depth that they lacked, they signed Jamal Crawford, who would be a 6th Man of the Year contender for the next 5 or 6 years. He slid right into the lineup as a key scorer. They then signed Matt Barnes for defense at small forward. And then to round out the bench, they signed Grant Hill and Ryan Hollins. We all know Ryan Hollins for his terrible takes on First Take, but he was not that bad. A lot of people clown on him, but he really was not that bad. All right. They also added Lamar Odom as a backup big man. This was mainly just to pick up minutes from DeAndre and Blake. They lost Nick Young and Randy Foye in free agency, but their additions filled the gap left by Nick Young. The Clippers were on a tear. They won 56 games. It's important to note the Western Conference, like I said earlier, it was stacked. The Thunder, Spurs, Grizzlies, and the Lakers failed super team.
Steve Nash.
Yeah, you think about it at the beginning of the year. I mean, that you're looking at that conference as an absolutely stacked conference. I know the Lakers fell off because of injuries and that super team did not work.
What was it, Dwight, Nash, and Kobe?
And Gasol, and our Artest, or Meta World Peace, whichever one you want to call
World Peace.
But so the Clippers are doing all of this. They won 56 games in a loaded West with a pretty young team, I would say. The Clippers were a 4 seed, so they had Chris Paul and Blake Griffin make the All-Star game, which is pretty cool for a Clippers team that gets overshadowed by the Lakers consistently. Blake had a rough last 2 games as he was injured. He got hurt in practice while actually stepping on Lamar Odom's foot. So they would actually lose in 6. And it was a 2-2 series. And they lost games 5 and 6 to the Grizzlies as Blake went down. So they were just undermanned. And you could tell it was probably time for a coaching change. They wasted literally no time. They fired head coach Vinny Del Negro, and they would hire Doc Rivers in a rare sign-and trade. They actually sent a pick to the Celtics.
Easy money.
It was pretty remarkable. The Clippers would draft Reggie Bullock, 25th overall. He didn't make too many major contributions, but that's interesting to note that they drafted him.
He's a serviceable NBA player now.
He's a good player now, but I'm saying he didn't make a big contribution.
He popped up on the Knicks, and then he had a couple of solid games for the Mavs in the playoffs this year.
They would trade Eric Bledsoe and Caron Butler for Jared Dudley, who played a good bench role. I know Jared Dudley's a meme too. They're getting a lot of players that are memes. They traded for sniper J.J. Redick from the Bucks, and this is when they really took off. They got Chris Paul to an extension, and they added Danny Granger and Darren Collison for more depth. And those 2 signings were very big off the bench. They lost their old guys, Grant Hill, Billups, and Odom. They didn't really matter at that age. The roster was very well-rounded. However, J.J. Redick did miss 22 games due to injury. Otherwise, he would have been the main shooting guard. So their main lineup throughout the season was Chris Paul, Darren Collison, Matt Barnes, Blake, and DeAndre Jordan. So a little bit of a bigger lineup outside of Chris Paul. The team won 57 games and was a 3 seed. So 57 games and a 3 seed in the West, and you're thinking this might be our year, right?
Didn't they win 56 last year? 56 and we're a 5 seed?
The year before they won. Yeah, they won 56 and we're a 5 seed, and you win 57 in a slightly more stacked West as the Warriors are on the rise. They would actually beat the Warriors in 6 in the first round, but then you meet the Thunder in the second round. This was after they traded away Harden, but that team was still stacked. You have Durant, Westbrook, and Ibaka.
And Perkins.
Never
forget.
And they got
legend.
Absolutely annihilated. The Thunder would win in 6. This is another case of the Clippers running into a crazy loaded roster. Next offseason is the biggest offseason that they had, and the next season would be like their championship window. This is when the window is open the widest. They have the best This is the best team. Blake Griffin is at his peak. Chris Paul, arguably at his peak. DeAndre Jordan is at his peak. Everyone's at his peak. And so we're going to get into it. No big moves in the offseason. This is when they traded for Austin Rivers, like I said earlier. They traded for him at the deadline. They lost Willie Green. They lost Collison and Granger in the offseason. But those players were not being utilized too much. Like, they weren't going to be utilized into this coming season. Interesting to note, Steve Ballmer took over ownership after the Donald Sterling situation in the playoffs in the previous year. So you're looking at a new owner, exciting, a lot of buzz around the team. This was by far the Clippers' best team, like I said. They had the best offensive rating in the league, and they won 57 games. The issue that this team had is that defensively, at the small forward position especially, they lacked because they really just had Matt Barnes. And once you get a switch, you have two smaller guards, J.J. Redick and Chris Paul. So they're not good at defense.
Not at all.
Not in the slightest bit. So guys like Kevin Durant, you get a switch. Kawhi, LeBron, all the small forwards in the league, Paul George, it's not looking good. This year, the West was wide open. This was the first year of the Warriors. And a lot of people didn't really know about the Warriors at the beginning of the season. So if you think about it, the Clippers are probably the second best contender outside of the Thunder, who still had Russ and KD. The Spurs were getting older, and the Thunder actually did get injured this year. But we didn't know that going into the season. Even in the East, there were question marks about Cavs early in the season. Remember, the Cavs got off to a slow start.
Yep.
They just got LeBron. So the league's wide open, and the Clippers want to take advantage. So, like I said, they won 57 games. They matched up against the Spurs in the first round, and this is one of the best playoff series of the decade. The Spurs were older. They were still the Spurs. You know, they still had Parker, Ginobili, Duncan, Pop, Kawhi. They had everyone. This was a crazy series, a 7-game series, and it's decided by a Chris Paul masterclass Game 7 performance. He hit the game-winning shot, a floater.
Yeah, a floater.
Green on Paul, and he got it! 1 second left!
He had 27 points, all on a torn hamstring.
Yeah.
Absolutely insane. This injury, though, it would put Paul out for the first 2 games of the next series. And this is the biggest series the Clippers would have. They would collapse against the Rockets. They were up 3-1, and they would just, it was terrible. Chris Paul was playing hurt. James Harden and the Rockets made a masterful comeback. If you remember, if you were an NBA fan and you were watching at that time, Josh Smith and Corey Brewer turned into absolute legends in that series. They provided crazy scoring off the bench. They gave the Clippers a really hard time, and the Clippers would lose. Chris Paul was out the first 2 games. That's notable. The Clippers would split the first 2 games. So maybe if Chris Paul plays, they win the series. And these are starting all the what-ifs that you have with this Clippers team. What if Chris Paul doesn't get injured? Then they go to play the Warriors, maybe? Do they beat the Warriors?
No.
Probably not,
I don't
but
think so. Especially because the Warriors had that switch offense where they would just run around the 3-point line. There's no way with an injured Chris Paul they'd be able to hang with them.
the elevator screens.
Yeah.
The Warriors would obviously end up winning against the Cavs, against the depleted Cavs.
Matthew Dellavedova.
Delhi.
The greatest series of all time.
Now, the next offseason was a very confusing offseason. And if you were on NBA Twitter at that time, you will remember the DeAndre Jordan situation. So it was reported a little bit before free agency that DeAndre Jordan would sign with the Mavericks. Now, I know what you're thinking. That is clearly tampering, right? How does he already know where he's going to sign? Well, the tampering gets worse. A bunch of Clippers players and coaches would go to DJ's house in Texas and convince him to stay. They were posting pics on Twitter all night, and they were pretty much clowning the Mavericks. Now, Mark Cuban, the owner of the Mavericks, was absolutely furious, and it was absolutely a hilarious time. And the tampering was absolutely insane. I really don't know how they didn't get fined or lose a draft pick for that. That really does not make any sense.
I feel like there's always tampering every year. Like the Brunson had to be tampering this year.
Well, yeah, because we all knew he was going to the
Yeah,
Knicks
it
like
was-
3 days before free agency.
Yeah. So I mean, tampering probably wasn't as bad back then, but it's pretty much every major free agent signing that's somewhat tampering involved, which is kind of crazy.
But this was like
Yeah.
documented.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, man. They made a few off-season moves, but nothing too notable. They did sign old man Paul Pierce, but he was really bad. Like,
The truth.
he was straight up not good. They did trade for Jeff Green at the deadline for bench depth, so that was pretty important. Clippers would win 53 games. They were the 4 seed. And they honestly did not have the manpower to win the championship this year. They had injuries to Blake Griffin, which held him out for most of the season. They played Portland in the first round. They tied up the series 2-2, but Blake Griffin and Chris Paul would suffer injuries that would keep them out the rest of the series, and they would lose in 6. So, more injuries. Fuck the Clippers. And that's rough. So, the next season, this is the last season of the Lob City Clippers. It was a weird year. It was up and down. They brought back the same roster. There were question marks about team chemistry. I don't know if you've ever listened to the JJ Redick podcast, but they talked about it with Blake Griffin, and there were definitely chemistry concerns. Chris Paul, did he want to play there? That was a big question. Did he want to play there anymore? Head coach Doc Rivers, he was supposed to be the guy that puts them over the hump, and he hasn't even gotten them to a conference finals.
The Clippers have never been to a conference finals in their entire history.
Outside of last year, or outside of 2 years ago when they played the Suns, right? So that was the first time in their entire history that they got to the conference finals. Remember they beat the Jazz in the second round? They lost to the Suns in 6. And Lil Wayne was there. Why was Lil Wayne on the court?
Suns are bums. I don't know.
The Suns are buns?
I don't know. I don't care. I don't recall, but it is crazy. Another fun fact is that the Clippers used to be the Buffalo Braves. Did you know that?
No, I did not know that.
Yeah, they used to be the only basketball team in Buffalo.
That is absurd.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why there's no other teams in Buffalo.
Yeah, that's true.
Like I said, no major additions or subtractions with regards to their roster. The Clips won 51 games. They were a 4 seed in the West. They matched up against the Jazz in the first round. It's important to note the Jazz were not supposed to be competition for this veteran Clippers team. Like, everybody had the Clippers beating the Jazz. Jazz were young and had little experience. But Gordon Hayward and Rudy Gobert led the Jazz to beat the Clips in 7. That's right. Gordon Hayward.
He was a phenomenal basketball player.
Starred on a playoff team.
He was extremely good before he got injured.
He was.
It's a tragedy what happened to him.
I mean, he wasn't top 10. He wasn't going to be top 10.
No, he doesn't have to be top 10. He was a very good basketball player.
He was a very good basketball
And
player.
then his leg decided to do a 180. So
Literally a 180. Anyway, once again, the Clippers were hampered by injuries. Blake Griffin was out for the series after suffering a toe injury in a Game 3 win. Now, the Clippers were up 2-1 at that time. So if you think about it, if Blake plays, do you think they advance? I don't know.
if they advance, he's still injured, and then they'll probably lose in the next round.
That's the thing.
So I don't really think it affects the Clippers that much. I mean, obviously it affects them, but
especially because they would have played the Rockets, I believe.
Yeah, James Harden was going for 40 a game with 30 free throws. It was nuts how that worked back then.
After this season, it was clear they needed to break up the team because they were not going anywhere with their current roster. They sent Chris Paul to the Rockets. They traded Blake to the Pistons at the deadline the following year. And they let J.J. Redick go in free agency. A few years later, they would let DJ go to the Mavs. Where?
Oh, we finally got to go there.
That's pretty crazy. Since then, the Clippers were able to rebuild into title contenders. They finally made a conference finals in 2021, like we just talked about. This Lob City team will always be defined by injuries and what-if questions. So that is the end of today's stories. Any thoughts?
The way you broke it down, it looks like they did zero effort in signing any role players for the team. That seems to be their major problem. They didn't sign anyone. Like, I can't name one major role player that made a huge difference other than Jamal Crawford. And he just got older. It's not like he was going to carry the entire bench.
Yeah, so the issue that they had was salary cap problems.
Yeah.
And this is what most of these teams run into. And this is why it's interesting when you give money to guys like Blake Griffin, who while he is very good, while he was very good, he's not the number one option on a championship team. No. See what I'm saying? He was never a number one option on a championship team.
Is Chris Paul a number one option on a championship team? I don't think so either.
Yeah, I don't know. So, like, you're giving money to guys who... It's sort of what the Wizards did with John Wall, if you think about it. They gave him money, but he was never going to be a number one on a championship team.
Let's make it clear. The Wizards were never a championship team.
No, I'm not saying they were. I'm just saying he's never going to be a number one on a championship team. So, and they just did it with Bradley Beal, too.
Yeah.
So,
you think it's more of a pride thing? Like, keeping their players? Like, Bradley Beal just signed, what was it, the second highest contract in the NBA for what?
To win 30 games.
Yeah. So you think it's a pride thing that they sign these players to these massive deals just so they wouldn't leave?
I think it's exactly that. I think it's like, we want to keep him so that you don't get him.
Yeah.
And the only way that you can get him is if you give me 10 picks or whatever Gobert was traded for.
So obviously the problem was the injuries and the depth. When you have when Paul Pierce is your major offseason signing, when he's like 42, you know there's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking through these rosters, and what I realized is, well, like, there was a lot of hype around the Clippers, and I'm wondering if they were in a smaller market, would there have been that much hype? Like, if they were in Milwaukee, I don't think there would have been that much hype, because DeAndre Jordan, his offensive skill set is very limited. His defensive skill set is very good around the rim, and he was a very good rebounder, but he's not gonna lock up. He's not gonna lock up DeMarcus Cousins. You know, you're paying him that money to lock up the top big men in the league.
It's hard to look at it because he was like a good big man for the 2000s, but during that time period was when you got to see the change from like the old big man to the new big man with Anthony Davis and DeMarcus Cousins, and I don't know, Marcus Gasol started shooting the 3-pointer, and he started shooting it well, so...
Yeah, that's what I was actually going to get into. I was going to ask, do you think if the Clippers were during the 2000s versus the 2010s, do you think anything different happens?
Yeah, I think their play style, like, more fits, like, an early 2000s, like Flight would say, like an early 2000s type of basketball, where they run and dunk. They didn't really shoot the 3-ball that well, other than J.J. Redick. They didn't really have a major 3-point shooter. Like, Chris Paul is a fadeaway mid-range guy, and DeAndre Jordan is a dunker, and Blake Griffin really was limited other than dunking. I guess he can kind of shoot the 3 now, but he literally can jump 6 inches off the ground, so it's a little different how the league works today and how it worked back then.
Yeah, so they were definitely in a transition period that did not work for them.
It didn't work for them, and it worked for the Warriors, who won now 4 championships.
The rise of the Warriors.
Yeah.
It's funny because I remember ESPN used to market that as a rivalry, but the Warriors would wash.
Yeah, they would always whoop them. And there was nothing the Clippers could really do. They can't switch on the screens. Can't get over the elevator screens.
And you can't sit back.
Yeah.
You're going to ask DeAndre Jordan to go out there and guard Chris Paul?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to work.
I mean, not Chris Paul, Steph Curry, but you know what I mean. Well, that's all we have for today.
That's all about the Lob City Clippers. I'll see you next week on the Zoo and Goo Storytime Podcast.
All right, peace.